Today, we take our inspiration from a word that is repeated in practically every verse of our responsorial psalm. And the word is rock. It should remind us of what Jesus said to his disciples at the conclusion of his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, where he speaks about the wisdom of building a house on rock. He must have learned this from his father, Joseph the carpenter, who was a builder. You don't build a house on sand, he says. Rather, you build it on rock, meaning on a solid foundation, if you want it to be able to withstand the test of time and natural calamities. Lalo na pa naman tayo in the Philippines. We're supposed to be the capital, the calamity capital of the world. Sometimes when calamities like earthquakes happen, our buildings are tested. And we have reason to be alarmed when we begin to see cracks or disjointed beams. It is then that we usually seek the services of a structural engineer to evaluate the structural integrity of a building. When the engineers find out that the integrity of the structure has been severely compromised, they declared it condemned. And then they order its closure. They warn the owner that one big shake can make it collapse and cost people's lives, and the owner could be held accountable for the disaster. The choice is either to spend a lot of money retrofitting it to save the structure, like what we do with our heritage churches. You probably heard that the Holy Rosary Parish Church, where I used to be parish priest in Angeles City, suffered from severe damages in the previous earthquake. And they had to retrofit it, spending tens of millions. Well, either you retrofit it or you demolish it altogether and build a totally new structure. We are presently in a global state of calamity. Our societies are like houses that have been severely tested by a microscopic virus. Economies are at the brink of collapsing. Healthcare systems are getting overwhelmed. Political systems are getting tested. Businesses and industries are folding up, and people are going jobless. Governments are challenged to cushion the tremendous impact of these developments on our people. And so, it is worth asking, will we just aspire to get back to normal after this global crisis when it is over, knowing that the house in which we live has been severely damaged? Will it be good enough to do some retrofitting? Or do we need to demolish and rebuild? In today's gospel, Jesus is being quizzed by the Pharisees. You know, he should feel insulted because the question that they are asking him is a typical question that a rabbi would ask a 13-year-old Jewish boy. It's part of the ritual of being Jewish. When they reach 13 years old, they undergo the ritual that is called the ritual of coming of age, bar mitzvah. Remember Jesus getting lost in the temple at the age of 12? I think it was because he fell in love with the biblical studies in Jerusalem for his preparation for bar mitzvah. Every Jewish male is supposed to memorize the greatest commandments. Kaya, parang insulting yung tanong. They were treating Jesus like a little boy. The question is, which commandment of the law is supposed to be the greatest? Masyadong obvious yung question. But Jesus, sport naman siya. He rides along. He answers the question anyway. And perhaps he even answered in a sing-song way in which the Jewish kids recited it from rote memory. The line from Deuteronomy chapter 6. It is called in Hebrew the Great Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord alone. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Pakanta pang nire-recite yan ng mga bata. But, after Jesus recited it like a little boy, suddenly, he pulled the rug under their feet by adding a second commandment. What second? Wala namang second para sa mga Pharisees. At least not in the way they learned it in school. And in fact, he says, the second is like the first. The second is like it, meaning it is of the same value as the first. Medyo nagulat sila dito. It is something you cannot do without. And he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And where is he getting this from? From the book of Leviticus chapter 19, which, by the way, is practically the equivalent of our first reading from Exodus chapter 22. Ako nga, I'm surprised. Sana Leviticus 19 na lang ang ginawa nilang first reading. But it is the equivalent. Halos pareho ang content. But Leviticus 19 begins with a statement, you must be holy because the Lord your God is holy. Parang tall order, ano? I would understand that the Lord our God should be holy. Pero yung logic, you should be holy because God is holy. Well, remember, the background for this is you're supposed to be a creature in the image and likeness of God. Kamukha daw natin ng Diyos. That is why the Jewish people did not like making images of God. I think it's because they believe that the best image of God is your fellow human being. If God is holy, then God is expecting us to reflect His holiness in the way we live our lives. Yung version ni St. Matthew dito, be perfect, just as your Father is perfect. Parang lalong naging mahirap. Sino ba sa atin nag-aambisyon na maging perfect anyway? I like better the version of St. Luke. Ang sabi niya, be merciful because your Father is merciful. The rest of Leviticus chapter 19 is a practical elaboration on what holiness entails. It is not just about engaging in pious practices like praying in the temple or offering sacrifices and burnt offerings. Holiness is rather about being merciful and compassionate to the most disadvantaged in society. The late Latin American bishop and theologian, Bishop Pedro Casaldaliga, calls it political holiness. First time na nabasa ko, I was taken aback. Parang hindi ko mapagsamang politics and holiness. But he says, political holiness. It is supposed to be the solid foundation on which Israel was required to build a humane society, namely, prioritizing the welfare of the most vulnerable ones, like the strangers and the migrants. Bakit? Take note of the logic of Exodus 22. Ang sabi niya sa Israel, be kind to strangers. Be kind to them. Bakit? You were strangers yourselves once upon a time. I know we all presuppose that the Israelite people were oppressed in Egypt. I don't believe all the Egyptians were oppressors. I think they also found good people there who were very kind to them. Ang dami nating OFWs. They are all strangers. Mga dayuhan silang lahat. Wherever they find themselves around the world. And people are kind to them. Well, some people are not kind to them. In the same way, we're expected to be kind also to strangers. Kahit takot tayo usually sa mga strangers. So, if you want your society to be founded on holiness, you have to take care of the widows and the orphans, mga balot ulila. And if I may elaborate, on the poor, the people with disabilities, the elderly, the physically sick, the mentally ill, the jobless, the homeless, etc. At ang summary ni Jesus for all of this is, love your neighbor as yourself. And it practically says that what we claim as love of God is fake. It is false if we don't have love of neighbor. St. John says this also in his first epistle, chapter 4, verse 20. And he rubs it in. Ang sabi niya, sinungaling ako. I am a liar if I claim to love the God I do not see, but I do not know how to love the neighbor whom I see, because he is supposed to be image and likeness of God. A few days ago, we had an interfaith dialogue, and it was sponsored by the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. If they're following this Mass, I'd like to thank you, sisters, for organizing that wonderful dialogue. It was quite an experience. The person who spoke before me was a Jewish professor and peace advocate. I represented the Catholic Church. The person who spoke after me was a Muslim lady lawyer and professor at the University of the Philippines. The fourth resource person was a Protestant lady liberation theologian. Interesting exchange. Among the things that I found most striking, the words of the Jewish scholar really struck a chord. She said, we can only start to dialogue if we humanize, not demonize. Ang ganda nun. If we humanize, not demonize the ones we dialogue with. The Muslim lady lawyer, on the other hand, referred to love of God and love of neighbor as oneself, as the foundation of dialogue. And we were all surprised because she's not Christian, she's Muslim. And she referred to the two commandments, love of God and love of neighbor, as the foundation of dialogue. And I checked out the interfaith dialogues that had been previously organized by the Pope. And usually the Center for Interreligious Dialogue is the place where St. Francis of Assisi was born. Assisi, the city of Assisi. And I found out that in all the previous dialogues, even the Buddhists and the Hindus, aside from the Jews and the Muslims, affirmed the basic statement that love of God and neighbor as oneself was the unquestionable foundation of dialogue. I have said this on many occasions before. Maybe our societies are still built on the weak foundation of competition, the survival of the fittest. Matira ang matibay. Sabi nila, ito daw yung law of evolution. Yes, maybe for animals. Because it is the instinct of animals to compete. Matira ang matibay. Talaga naman kung mga hayop lang tayo, yun lang talaga susundin nating prinsipyo. Matira ang matibay. Papatay-patay ka, pasensya ka. But we're not animals, are we? Naiinsulto nga tayo when they call us animal or hayop. Because we say we're human beings. Is it possible that we are just beginning to experience a fuller evolution towards a better version of the human species? Jesus has a different term for the better version of ourselves. It is not just thinking humanity. Ang tawag dyan sa Latin, Homo sapiens. Pinagmamalaki natin na pinakamagaling na hayop ang tao kasi nag-iisip. Kahit mag-isip ka kung ugaling hayop, hayop pa rin. Pwede mo rin gamitin ang utak sa kahayupan. I think the higher form of humanity ay hindi taong nag-iisip kahit mahalaga ang isip, kundi taong nagmamahal. Noon lang nagsisimulang magmukhang tao at magpakatao ang tao. In Latin, I invented the word homo amans. Kasi amare, yun yung to love eh. Loving is amans. Homo amans. The loving humanity. Ang taong nagmamahal. Mas mataas na uri ng tao. Kahit pinakadukha mo ang tao, kung siya'y nagmamahal, mas mataas ang uri niya kesa dun sa saksakan ng yaman at kapangyarihan, pero asal hayop. Perhaps, it is good news after all that the COVID-19 has shaken the weak foundations of the civilization of egotism, which we have built in the past centuries of human history. Now, I think, after this crisis, this global pandemic, we can invest all the blood and the sweat and the tears that we can in order to usher in a new and higher form of humanity that will rebuild a new civilization on the solid foundations of love of God and love of neighbor as oneself.